Good morning. So I'm going to recap yesterday's sessions of White Box with my local group. Brian, Katie, Phil, and Josh. This was amazing. Uh, so we had about a 2.5 hour session to kick it off. Then we went to lunch. We packed up, went out, had some lunch, talked about it the first session, had some, just some social time together. Then we came back to the table and we played session two. But really, it was one big 6 hour session, but a couple of 2.5 hour sessions. This I ran traditional. I played a straight up DM, old school Dungeons and Dragons DM, which meant that the world, I was utterly in control of the world. I narrated everything. There was no truth that they created, right? All they were responsible for was their character, their character's emotions, actions. The rest of the game was traditional DM, right? So I have not done this in 25 years as a traditional DM. Running it with, I don't have a screen, but I put up a couple of notebooks. I rolled certain things out of their vision. And we didn't have any moments in this session where our thief, Katie's halfling Marta, there was no moment where she tried to hide in shadows, which I would have, she would have just said she's hiding in shadows. I would have made the roll. She wouldn't know if she was being successful until she was spotted. But we didn't have any of those moments. We didn't have any trap issues. We didn't have any moments where she needed to hide in shadows. We didn't have any underground cave dwelling where I would roll for the dwarf to spot secret passages. But I would roll for all of those things for them passively. And then I would just narrate if it had happened to Garwin, Brian's dwarf. I would have just said, hey, you spot something's amiss. They've tried to hide a fissure in the canyon wall, in the cave wall. It's a secret passage, right? But I didn't have to. Nothing like that came up in the session. Surprise! I rolled surprise in two events, right? The only two combat events they had, I had to roll surprise for their characters to see if their characters were surprised. They were surprised in the second event, but they were not surprised in the first event. I made the roll really for the creature. Well, I'll explain it. So my point is, this is the most formal I have ever been with this group. As Brian said at lunch, and they talked about it, it was a completely different experience than they normally have with me. Normally, I explain everything. Normally, I explain to them. I'll say to them, okay, here's what we're going to do. Is that fair? I'm a very open GM, and I'm usually will make sure everything is clean and clear. I narrate everything in this. They don't create any truth. They are only responsible for their character's emotions, actions, motivations. That's it. And I narrated everything, and that includes the combat. So when they make a roll, if they missed, I narrated, how that went. If they hit, I narrated how they did damage to the creature, etc. There was no moment where I said, okay, you killed the bandit. Tell me how you did that. I just narrate how they dispatched the bandit. It was smooth. It was quick. I think they really appreciated the fact that they were free to be just players in this mysterious world. And it was tough for me because there were moments where I had to catch myself wanting to say to them, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to roll for surprise. Normally I do that, right? This was old school, really old school. And I got to tell you, it was a refreshing. It was completely refreshing. And I think I miss it. I think I miss that kind of DM role, right? Where, so let's recap it. I'll talk about it. So first thing we did when we got there was I gave them the characters that I rolled up that can be seen on the channel. Katie and Phil swapped. Katie did not want to play the fighter with 16 strength. Phil swapped her. So she said, would you swap me the halfling thief? So he had no problem with that. So Phil gave her the halfling thief. She named the halfling Marta. He named his fighter Charles. Brian named his dwarf fighter Garwin. And Josh named his cleric brother Tim. And that was the extent of all they had to do to start. Now I told them they were free to make characters if they wanted to. I told Katie, if you don't want to play that fighter, let's just roll up another. But they swapped. They just swapped and made it easy. I also told them I didn't want to do Broadlands. I've been running Broadlands for years. I wanted this to be a map crawl, not a hex crawl, a map crawl. And what that means is the map is completely blank. And as they travel, we will resolve a map block. Okay, and I'll show you how we did that. I've got my notebook. Here's my notes. I got the characters. So here's what we were able to achieve in 6 hours, right? right there. So I drew a line that says border, frontier lands are south. Everything north of the border was unknown lands, completely free for the world to be created. Every block, so you can see, I think check marks where Brian marked where they wanted to head with a pencil. And when they completed that day's travel and all events, whatever it was, I would actually square in the square. So they knew they had been here. And then when they moved the next day, they headed northeast. When they concluded that day, I squared it in. When we, on the third day, they found Wellesley, which is a town. I'll explain it in the recap. And then we labeled it W. And then I wrote over here, anything that we labeled that was relevant was labeled on the, so Wellesley's on the map, the mine is on the map, and Galshat is on the map. Okay. Anyway, and the blocks are roughly a league, 15 to 20 miles. They can basically explore that block in a day, and whatever I happen to roll or whatever happens to happen just seems to, it's just a major event in that window of time. Okay. So that explains what we're doing. I'm using random charts from my Broadlands book. They're just not connected to the politics or the cultures of Broadland. This is completely generalized fantasy fiction, right? So they can imagine why they're in plate mail, why one of them is in plate mail, one of them is. It's more of a broad fantasy, traditional, old school, a little dark, a little gritty. This was pretty good. Okay, so they started off. I just told them somewhere along the border. Where do you want to launch from? And Brian said, "This is fine, right? Because it's irrelevant. I mean, it didn't matter. They could have started in the corner, right in the middle, whatever. Okay, but they needed to be on the border. So I just described to them how they're passing through that block, and the day as the day goes, it's undulating footlands, etc., with some copse of trees and some arroyos. It's pretty uneven wasteland ground. There is nothing really, here it's a wasteland. They camp the first night, everything goes fine. Second day they travel, and again, I'm demanding they eat ration. I tell them they can't forage, they can't hunt, they can't fish. The game requires they have rations or food from something, right? Third day, I described they see an old stone wall keep in the distance, and they can see it's an old circular empire fort that's broken down. There's holes in the wall. From here, it's hard to say how high the walls are, except the walls are high enough that they're obscuring what's ever inside the old fort, but they can see smoke plumes from fires or something. So they go down and they find out the walls are about 14 feet high, and as they circumvent. As Brian's leading them, they circumvent. He's pretty much kind of is in front with his shield, etc. And Katie, the halfling, and the cleric are kind of in the middle, and then Charles with his 6 hit points and his 17 armor classes in the back. Okay. They kind of go around this, and they find where the wall is literally gone and broken down, and they can see where it's overgrown, and they can see in there's a village actually inside an old stone keep. And they see there's about 5-6 buildings with fire, with obviously one of them is a smokestack from the blacksmith who they can see out front working. And they enter and they see a sign that says "Welcome to Wellesley." So they've discovered this village, but the village is inside an old stone ruin. And there's about 6 buildings. They approach Dodd. They learn of the blacksmith Dodd. Dodd tells them, greets them and tells them and talks to them. And in that role play, they find out that the building over there is the brothel. That's Miss Samantha's brothel. They find out that Vincent runs the tavern/inn. They find out that who's the other one? He's Dodd, the blacksmith. The manor, the Lord's manor. They see another stone manse with an iron gate that's kind of built into the rubble and the ruins of what's left of the stone wall. They obviously recycled some of this to build his stone keep. And he said, "That's Wellesley. That's Lord Wellesley's manor. This is really his keep, his land, and we just are, here. And this place is pretty much a stop-off place for travelers, adventurers, etc." Who else? There was somebody else there. Oh, the general store. Zero runs the general store. So they got pretty much everything they need here. They have 6 key infrastructure buildings. They find out from Dodd that he kind of needs raw materials. They make note of that. They then go over to the inn. They meet Vincent. Vincent makes them an offer, an obligatory or obligation. He tells them about a place called Herod's Ridge, about 30 minutes out of town. He tells them there's been some problems and they suspect there's a beast or something roaming around Old Herod's Ridge hanging tree. And if they would endeavor to investigate that, he would pay them 20 gold, and he would also make them a deal on weekly rooms for rent with Mills. And but they have to make some effort, and they have to want to make this their headquarters, right? So we're doing in a way a West Marches thing, right? But we'll see. Depends on how they go about it. All right. Okay, so they tell him, well, think about it. They go out and they explore the inside of the keep. They find old stone stairs that would have taken them up onto the wall. The wall is stone. There's no internal mechanisms in the wall. So it ain't like doors into the wall. These were stone walls with stone stairwells up on the inside where you could get up on the wall and circumnavigate the walls. But the walls are brittle, broken down. It's really not a defensive, but I mean, it would protect them from wind, weather, and it would be a little bit of a deterrent maybe from but if an army of goblins came on Wellesley, they would literally come through the cracks in the walls and the broken down old pieces. So, but this is Wellesley. After they walk, and there's a church. I forgot the church. So Father Myrtle runs the little chapel church. Okay, that was the other building. Anyway, so they have really everything they need. They have the chapel, the church. They have of the one God. They have their brothel. They have an inn/tavern. They have the blacksmith. They have the general store. They have pretty much everything they need to make this their home, and which is ultimately available to them as a launching point, right? Okay. They go back to Vincent and they say to Vincent, okay, it's about midday. They said, we're going to head on. Now tell me where this is again. And they says, just straight north, 30 minutes out of town. You'll go through some arroyos and some copse of trees. And it's a big tree on a ridge that used to be the Justicar Herod's hanging tree. It's where he would have public executions. But that was a long time ago. So long ago, it's grown up. The tree won't be as easy to spot now as all the vegetation and trees and bushes up around it have kind of obscured this remarkable old tree. But that's roughly where it's at, 30 minutes out of town. So 30-minute walk out of town. Well, again, they head out of town, and because they don't know where they're going, and because they don't have any way to really navigate, so to speak, you do have to make a wilderness check based on where they're at. And I rolled a 1. 1 means they get lost. They end up going east slightly. As they're coming over these things through the bushes, they can't see the tree from here, right? It's 30-minute walk, but there's undulating hills and foothills and trees. They end up in a ravine headed, west, and they stumble across, in a few minutes, they come to the mouth of an old mine, and a boy with a basket comes stumbling out full of dirt and rubble, and he dumps it, and he sees them, and he waves them, and he calls out 3 or 4 men. And they all come out and they greet these guys, and they have a pleasant conversation with these common men. They basically, not all of them. Oh, I forgot. They found their campsite before they found the mine. So they actually stumbled across their campsite and investigated it. They were able to make that there was about 8 to 12 people that had been in this campsite, bedrolls, smoldering fire, and they could follow all the footpath out west. So they first found their campsite. They went down a ravine until they came to the mouth. They met the boy. The boy called up about 4 men that were in the front of the mine, and they talked to him, and they all tell him, yeah, the Herod's Ridge is over there. The boy will take you, and the boy volunteers. Yeah, it's about a 20-minute hike east from here, northeast from here. I'll take you. So they meet these common folk, human miners. They're just people trying to reopen an old mine that collapsed. Okay, in the foothills. So the boy takes him. It takes him about 20 minutes. He takes him to the ridge and he points to him. He gets him up on the ridge and he says, hey, just follow this ridge. It'll undulate a couple times. And you can see just the top of the largest tree right over there. And again, it's, 180, 300 yards from here or something, down in a royal back up. So as they approach this area, Herod's Ridge, and this tree, they investigate. And they say they're looking for any signs of trouble, camps, whatever. And they stumble across old carcasses. They stumble across some bleached bones. They stumble across a freshly killed human being that they can't identify, partially devoured. They stumble across a dead fox, and they find these mounds of dirt where something's been digging, and they find a burrow. And the burrow is just large enough that a human stripped down, armor off, backpack off, gear off, could crawl into this burrow, or Katie, Marta, the halfling, could certainly trudge into it. Well, it's starting to get dusk. It's not yet dark, but it's getting dusk. And they decide, we're not going to go into it. This is crazy. We're going to set up strategically around it. And we're going to wait. And we're just going to sit and wait, weapons out, prepared. And as the sun sets, 5:30, 6 o'clock, they can spot. At this point, it's kind of dark. They can only see light and they can only see shadows and grays, darks and grays. They hear it before they see it. They can see this thing on all fours come out of this hole in the ground. And I roll surprise for the creature. They do surprise it. They can make out that it is some kind of a beast. It's got large teeth, claws. It stands up on its hind legs and smelling the air. And that's when I basically tell them, you have a moment here before he will identify your sense. So if you want to adjust. And so they immediately, Charles and Brian, attack it. And they get into a melee with it. And I describe how it is, and they know pretty quick on the first round as this thing gets two attacks. So and this is the creature I made. It is a werebeast, about 80 pounds in this form, right? They don't know it's a werebeast. They don't know it's some kind of half man, half beast turned. They end up in a melee with it. They find out that it claws and bites. Fortunately, no one was bitten in the first round. Marta and the cleric with only 2 hit points, Tim, Josh, brother Tim, they choose to stay out of the melee and they throw rocks. They say, can we throw rocks at it? Just try to distract it. I said, sure, it won't hurt it. It won't hurt your party. And if you successfully hit it with a rock, I will lower its attack grade just 1 point for the next round. But they still have to roll initiative. They still have to go in order. Okay, so the rocks may or may not be relevant. If the creature goes first, the rocks won't, at the end of that round wouldn't help many, etc. And it wouldn't carry over to the next round. So they had to win initiative and hit it with a rock to get a minus on the creature. Meanwhile, I'm explaining it's vicious. This thing is frothing. It's vicious. Charles is pummeled and bitten, and he's down to 1 HP when they finally bring it to 0. I think -1, but they can't kill it, but they knock it unconscious. And they all rush to Charles, and they're aiding Charles. And Josh says, I'm going to go investigate. What is this thing? And he goes over to it, and he sees that it's still breathing heavily, but it's unconscious. And he calls Brian over, and Brian drives his sword through it, or whatever he's got, spear, sword, I can't remember. He drives his sword through it, and he pulls it out, and you can see the muscles contract, and it winces and everything, but it's unconscious, but it's still breathing heavily. And at that point, they look back to Charles, and I tell Charles, you've got to make a save. You're sweating. You feel feverish. You do not feel well. And yes, you're at 1 hit point, but I mean, this is a wave of nausea. You're sweating profusely. Maybe it's shock, could be fever, but you need to make a save. He fails the save. They look back over at this creature because they're thinking, we've got to do something with this creature. It's still alive. And then they look back over at it. They see it's transformed back into a middle-aged, naked man, and they're, it's a werebeast. And they go over to him and they roll him over, and they see already that his wounds are beginning to heal. And the wound that Brian just put in his ribs to drive the sword through, they see it bubbling and spitting as it's starting to heal shut. And Katie immediately says, we need to bind this guy. So they cut the rope, and again I told them, we're doing this very formal, very traditional, more simulation. How are you doing this, right? I'm not going to just hand wave it. So Katie says, let's cut off 6 feet of our 50-foot of rope, and let's cut that in 2. And we'll tie him up with 3 feet of rope in the front. We'll tie him with 3 feet in the back, and we'll hang him from our 10-foot pole, and we'll carry him back to town. And we'll show him to Vincent, and we'll say, this is your problem, and we'll get paid, etc. And they all say, outstanding. We only have supposedly in the dark here 30 minutes or so to go. They don't want to camp here, although they've slain the beast. Katie's smart enough to go to all fours and crawl into its burrow. And I tell her, it stinks, it reeks, it's filthy. She crawls back about 40 feet. Again, she can almost squat in this burrow because she's a halfling. And she gets back into the mouth of its cave, and she's able to retrieve a few valuables from old clothing and things that have been drug in here from victims. So its hoard is not a stashed hoard. It is jewels and jewelry that was somehow left on the bodies of the carcasses. She's able to recover like a necklace and some rings from skeletons and bodies, and that is how the treasure is accounted for. And so she drags this out and says, whoop, we've got some loot, gents, and they head back to Wellesley. And again, I tell them in the dark, through the auroras, etc. You know really where you're going now. You can actually see maybe some lamps lit in the homes as you. So they get back without having to make another roll. They get into town and everything closes after dark, right? This is old school, right? So people are up at dawn and they close when it gets dark, and they go over to Dodd's place because they know Dodd fairly well, and they're concerned about shackling or using manacles, chains, something to secure this person. And they bang up Dodd. Dodd comes out and he says, "Holy cow! They've got this naked man bound and hanging from a 10-foot pole." And he walks over and looks, and they tell him, this thing was a beast that turned back when we knocked him unconscious. And he comes over and looks, and he says, "Oh my God, that's Weber. That's Weber Wellesley. That's the Lord's oldest son." And he says, "I am not going to confine this man. I'm not going to chain this man. It's your word versus his." And he's unconscious. They can see where his, and they point out, look how beat up Charles is. Look how wounded this, you can see what he's healing up. And so Katie works on him and convinces him through a couple of reaction checks to chain him up. And so the blacksmith drags a chain out to the center of the keep where they have an old stone that's embedded in the ground with a hook on it. He chains him up and manacles him around the neck, cuts his hands and legs free. He's still unconscious, leaves him unconscious. And why is he unconscious? Because he's technically at 0 or negative hit points. So he'll need 8 hours of rest to heal back 1 hit point. At that point, he'll become conscious. So he's going to remain alive but unconscious until he gets back to 1 hit point. And again, he is a were creature, so they really can't kill it without particular tools. Okay. He says, "I am not going to tell the Lord his son is a werebeast. I'm leaving that to you." And he goes back in and shuts himself off from them. And they decide, well, let's go over and tell Vincent. We'll tell Vincent we've discovered what the problem is at Harrods Ridge. We'll collect our gold. We'll sign the agreement of obligation with him for our room and board, and we're set. And we'll ask him to do this. They go over and they tell Vincent. Vincent's like, "Holy cow, I can't believe it. Weber is a werebeast. This is unbelievable." He pays him 20 gold, and then he makes him, he tells him, "You'll pay 2 gold each per week, plus you'll get 1 hot meal every day that you're here for your 2 gold." And they all agree to that deal. However, you'll all share 1 room, and that room has multiple bunks and storage for gear and equipment, etc. And so he said, you have free to pick whatever room, but you'll have to all 4 be in the 1 room. So they agree to this deal. They've got a headquarters now and a home for the most part. And they decide at that point to go to bed and leave the unconscious Weber, the blacksmith, and they don't send anyone to tell Lord Wellesley. At midnight, I narrate Charles. He awakens. He's sick. He's retching. He is in incredible pain. He can feel himself losing control. I said, "You need to make a save." He fortunately makes the save, and I say it's a feverish pain. And they all get up and they see him in the middle of the room going through this cramping, etc. But ultimately, he fights it off, and he doesn't turn. And I explained to him at moments you could see it looked like he was changing shape, that he was starting to grow hair, and he ultimately beat it off and passed out. So he's got 1 hit point. He won't be able to heal up from this 8 hours sleep because it was interrupted by a save to avoid turning, to avoid changing. Okay. The next morning, they get him up, and he's miserable, he's feverish, he's sick, and he is again got 1 hit point. They go out and they find everybody's in the town square. Every person, Horace from the brothel, Miss Samantha, everybody's there, and Weber is awake, and he's groggy, and he's sitting on kind of leaning back on the stone thing with a chain, and he's mumbling, and he wants to be free. And they send one of the prostitutes to bang up Lord Wellesley, and Father Myrtle comes over and investigates, and the party explains to him, "Listen, we need you to go tell the Lord about this. His son is a cursed being. He changes into some kind of beast." And of course, Father Myrtle, can't believe it. He walks up and inspects his body, sees some old scars, sees the major wound he put in him that was still slowly healing, and he could, he ultimately trusts it. And he looks at the party, and they tell him, and by the way, Charles, evidence that this is true is Charles was bitten, and you can see how ill he is. So Father Myrtle then goes over to the Lord's manor, and they allow him in, the Lord, and he brings the Lord over, and the Lord hears the story. And he says to Myrtle, he doesn't talk to the PCs. They're strangers. He's not remotely interested in these passers-by. But he tells Myrtle in front of the whole town, there's got to be a way to cure this. Do you know of anybody? Do you know anything? And Father Myrtle explains to the Lord, there is a witch in Galchat, northwest of here. She might have answers. And then he tells him, I'm taking my son home. I will lock him up. I will keep him confined until we can identify whether this is true, and until you can find out more from the witch. And he says, tell anybody who's interested in helping us do this, I'll pay them 100 gold, as he storms off with his servants and his son in chains. Myrtle turns to the party and says, you've heard that. He'll pay you 100 gold just to go talk to the witch and find out what you can. The party instantly, Katie says, oh yeah, we're going, because she knows, they all know Charles is probably infected. And so it would do them a bit of good. So they negotiate with the blacksmith Dodd for horses, and Vincent gives them some cheese and bread. So it gives them full trail rations, because they use 3 trail rations to get to Wellesley. So they needed to kind of replenish. They don't quite know how far Galchat, but the father explains to him, I was at Galchat years and years ago. I think it's a 2 or 3 day wide northwest, but I'm not certain. And he tells them that it's an old mine, it's an old ghost town. It's an old mining town that's dried up. There were about 4 to 5 buildings there. They were all dilapidated and destroyed. And the old witch lived in the only building left standing, a cabin on the far end of the small ghost town, of this old mining town that has dried up since the mines have been collapsed. They head northwest. They get lost on day 1. They wander around and they come to a cave. They find a cave. And they decide to set up camp about 50 yards from this cave mouth, and they decide to watch it for a full day, see if anybody comes or goes, see if any creatures come and go. And that means through the night, they're going to hold watch on the mouth of this cave and see if anything comes or goes. Meanwhile, Charles needs full 8 hours sleep to get a hit point back. So they decide they're going to not wake Charles. They're going to let him sleep for the full 8 hours. Hopefully they're not interrupted. So they do this. The next morning, I described, nothing came or went from this cave. Charles has got back a hit point. What do you want to do? So they take torches in hand and they go over to the cave. They leave Charles at the camp. He's got 2 hit points. They leave Charles at the camp. They go to the cave and they decide to investigate. So they light a torch and they head in. Katie leading the way without the torch, ahead of them about 5 feet, enough that she can kind of sneak if she needs to. Okay. They're back 5 feet or so. So she's casting, and I explained to him, there's a 30-foot radius for this torch. So you can, she's in the light if she's only 5 feet ahead of you. I don't think they, I think maybe they'd never crossed their mind, but I just, again, very formal. And I think they were surprised because everything with me was very direct, very formal. They go in about 50 feet or so, and they get to the end of this, I will say earth-hewn, clearly an old mining tailing, right? I mean, they put up old columns across the roof. You can see this used to be the opening of an old mining, not a cave, an old mine tail. So they go in about 50 feet and they come to the end of it and they find skeletons. There's mice and rats around. There's some refuge. They find an old bucket with some ore samples in it, and they see on the wall there's some veins of ore in the wall. So Katie breaks free a couple of this from the wall itself. They take a couple of samples from the old, and they agree they're going to show them to Dodd. Dodd might be able to identify them. There might be some value here. And they exit the cave. It's only, early morning. So they decide to pack up and go. And again, they knew they got lost to some degree, and they just know roughly they need to be heading northwest. So they mount up and they take off. And they travel for another day or so. They have to camp again. They don't get lost, but it's, they could actually be slightly east of it, etc. But they have to camp. This night, unfortunately, Charles doesn't get his full 8 hours, as they are jumped by common criminals. I won't even call them bandits. They were I basically made them just common thugs. So they aren't even as good as bandits. They're not organized. They're just like these poor common folk, and they try to waylay them in the middle of the night. They end up killing 2 of them. The morale check fails by the round 3, and all the rest of them run off into the dark. So they've killed 2 of these common criminals, bandits, thugs, whatever you want to call them. Again, they're not organized or good enough to really be bandits. They're just people. Okay. So anyway, that means Charles doesn't get his full 8 hours sleep. he's still at 2 hit points. Fortunately, he's not wounded. Brian, by the way, was wounded against the Weber Wellesley as the werebeast, but he wasn't bitten. He was clawed. He was never bitten. Unfortunately, Charles was clawed and bitten, and the bite is what could infect him, and he is infected. He hasn't had to make any more save throws. And anyway, they get to the witch. They find Galchat, right? This was like day 4, I think. Day 4, they were out there for 3 days because they stayed overnight to watch the cave, which is really smart to identify if there's anything. So it was very cool. They didn't just go right into the cave. They camped out, and they did this with they set up strategically for any creature that came out of that hole. So it was very cool. All right, they come onto Galchat, and sure enough, it's exactly as the father described, a dilapidated old ghost town. They see the sign hanging, Galchat, and they see the cabin at the far end, and there's smoke coming out of the top, and they approach, and Brian bangs the door, opening the door, meeting him at the door is this little old witch, Warts. She's completely blind. They can see that her eyes are completely cataract or whatever. She's clearly blind. She reeks the body odor and the odor from her cabin when she opens the door. I say it's almost enough that we have to make saving throws. And she talks so low that you have to get right on top of her to hear her. And so Brian says, well, all right, I come in close and I say, excuse me, what did you say? And they have a conversation. And he says, listen, we have 2 individuals we think are cursed with lycanthropy. Do you know of a cure? And she says, yes, I know of a cure. And the cure is going to require we are all together. And I won't tell you what we're going to need to do, but you need to take me back to Wellesley, the son of Wellesley, the other victim as well. And she's totally blind. And they don't tell her Charles is the other victim. And she reaches out with her scraggly old hand. She pats Charles on the shoulder and says, and you will be a part of this as well. So she could sense that he was infected. So Charles then asked her, I am cursed. I am infected. She said, yes, you will turn. And turning is something you can't predict. And that was the only way I was going to give them any information at this point about what the curse could do to him. Okay. They mount up and they ride back immediately. So they're riding back. It takes them a couple of days to get back because they know where they're going now. And again, they're marking this on the map. So they've marked down a mine, by the way. They met that camp of miners. They marked that on the map as a mine. They marked Wellesley and they marked Galstat. The other cave was a mine tailing, which they can find again. But they didn't mean to mark it. It was literally 50 feet. But that's where they got the sample. So they know they can go back, but we didn't mark it. It's too minor. The miners are people with a camp, right? So we put that on the map. Okay. They get back. Father Martel meets them in town center and says the woman cannot come into the chapel. I can't believe you brought that thing here. And she hisses and throws curses at him. And meanwhile, because of this, Charles has to. Katie basically says, "Take her away, Charles. Get her so we can talk to her father." So he takes her to the brothel. And Charles and her go off to the brothel to inside the brothel to get away from the father and the Mr. Holy guy, right? And they talk to him and they say, okay, she says there's a ritual that can be performed, but she hasn't told us what it is, and we need to have both of these men together before she explains the ritual. Okay, so Father Martel says, I don't imagine the Lord is going to allow that heathen, that heretic, that thing into his home. And Brian says, she didn't say where, it doesn't matter, but we all have to be together. So they all meet in town center. They go fetch the Lord Wellesley and they bring Weber out on a chain. And he comes out, of course, dressed now. He had been exposed. He was nude the whole before. They bring him out and she is whispering again. They can't quite make out what it is. She tells Brian to come, and then she tells Brian, I must have them together. They must be chained together on the thing. They must be stripped. They must be chained together. And I will need the blood of Lord Wellesley. We will have to bloodlet Lord Wellesley, which is going to be a tough sell, right, for the party. So they ultimately make some reaction checks. They negotiate. They tell Wellesley, on top of everything, don't you want to cure your son? Meanwhile, you owe us 100 gold. So Josh, the cleric, kind of steps in, which is interesting, and says, hey, by the way, you owe us 100 gold for bringing this woman back. He agrees begrudgingly, and they are able to bloodlet. They allow the father to bloodlet him, not the witch. So the father bloodlets him enough blood that she claims is enough. And she says, we wait till nightfall, and I will do the ritual at midnight. And so they all go about their business. She says, no, these two men have to stay here chained up in square. Again, the Lord Wellesley's not happy about his son being out here and exposed. They're both naked. They're chained together on this post, and they all go on about their business. And Katie from the inn all day long kind of keeps an eye on them, make sure they don't change or nothing goes on. And at some point in the late afternoon, before sundown, there's an event. And they hear it. They hear this caterwauling and fighting, and they bust out. Everybody in the town come to the street, and they see these two changed creatures fighting with each other, and they're ravaging each other, and it goes on and it goes on and it goes on until eventually one of them is unconscious, collapses, and the other beast tears the throat out of one of them. They don't know if it's Charles, they don't know if it's right, and they have to wait, and the whole town's there kind of in the dark with torches. They can see this unbelievable fight between these two 80 some odd pound half man half creatures. I don't even know what creatures they are, and they basically fight until one of them's incapacitated and tears the throat out, killing one of them. And they now have to wait until there's change. Well, once one's killed, it doesn't take long for it to change back, so they know that one of them is going to change back pretty quick. And does. However, this thing is on its chain, and it's every time anybody tries to come up with a torch to see which one it is, this thing will reach at them, lunge at them. And so they're all really forced to wait. They can't tell from here which person is dead. And of course, Phil is like, dude, is it me? What's going on? I'm like, you gotta find out. She comes out. The witch, by the way, was in the brothel. That's the only place they would let her stay, is in the brothel. So she comes out to conduct the ritual. She gets within torch range, but stays outside the chain range, and she begins to paint on the ground, and she begins to recite some speech they can't hear, again, because she's so low. Again, you can't hear unless you're right in her face. Meanwhile, it calms the beast down onto all haunches and then onto its belly, and drifts off and turns. And as it turns, they all step forward and look with the torch, and they can see that it is Wellesley. And she says, the blood, quick, the blood, the blood. So they bring over his father's blood, Lord Wellesley's blood, and they begin to pour this into his mouth as she says, while he's asleep, they're pouring it in while she is murmuring spells. And then they leave him. He vomits up a couple times, retches. He doesn't change shape. And she says, now we wait until morning. And everybody might as well go back. And meanwhile, Charles has lost his character. Phil has lost his character, Charles. So Charles lost the battle, lost his throat. And she says to the party, as they escort her back to the brothel, she says, Charles couldn't have been saved anyway. And they're like, what? Why? And she says, because we need the blood of his sire, his father. And obviously, Charles is not from here. His father is nowhere to be found. And they all really go, what? Yeah, who is his father? Did he have a father? What? So she said, we couldn't rescue him anyway. We needed the blood of his sire, his father. So hopefully Lord Wellesley, this is Lord Wellesley's son, right? Because if they don't share blood, it won't cure him. Okay. So the next morning they come out, they find that he is healed up. They've removed Charles's body, by the way. It has been destroyed. They've burned the body in the night, and the boy's up, and she investigates. She casts some spells on him and says, yes, he is cured. You may go home. You may return to your family. And Lord Wellesley, of course, pays them their 100 gold. They get their full XP for destroying the werebeast, although they didn't actually kill him, but they ultimately led to the destruction of the curse and this particular werebeast. They got their obligation dealt with at the inn, so they now have a home base. I told Charles, go ahead and make another character, and I told them all, why don't you all make a handful of characters? This is your home base. You'll be able to continue to play with whatever characters you want. So kind of a West Marches style, except to have a home base. And that was it. That was the day. We were done. This was broken into 2 sessions. We ended the first session when Wellesley said, go find the witch. That was the end of the first session. They got part of the XP for bringing the werebeast back. They got some XP for finding the treasure, etc. And we went to lunch, came back, and we started with them getting the horses and the ride out, looking for Galchat and the witch. The second session was much longer, actually, because they were on, I think they were out 6 days. They stayed in camp for it was a total of 6 days. And every day I have to make rolls for what they encounter in the blocks. Even coming back, I'll make a roll if there's a wandering monster, etc. So it took a lot longer than it seems, but we had about a 2.5-hour session to start, 3-hour session later. So about 5.5 hours, 6 hours. I got home a little late and I'm a little tired, but it was great. And at lunch, they expressed how much they were enjoying this more formal kind of deliberate DMing. And they don't even get that with Brian with Pathfinder 5th edition. And they liked, I couldn't quite get from them whether they liked that it was a little more simulations. They certainly were strategic and didn't take any cueing from me. I did tell them on the rope, you're going to time with 50 feet of rope. What are you going to do? And so I said, so they actually have 44 foot of rope, and they have 2 3-foot ropes. Now in their inventory, they have 4 horses, which they have to give back to. Oh, that's right. The Dodd had said, yes, you can borrow the horses, but if they die, you pay for them. So they gave the horses back to Dodd at the blacksmith, and they got their XP. Charles, Phil's going to have to make another character. We didn't do it. We didn't do it right there. I told him we'd just do it. Brian owns a book. I gifted a copy of White Box to Steve, Harold, and Brian when we were playing White Box. So Brian had his at the table. And I said, you can also get the PDF really cheap. So Brian, I think, will probably sit down and make some characters for them, as well as with Phil and the guys before the next time. And we're going to try to get together every 5 weeks or so and do these kind of epic days, 4 to 6 hours of gaming. I love it. I tell you what, and I forgot almost what it was like to run a traditional DM role where I'm behind a screen. They only know what they know. They don't know anything else. I don't explain to them how the rules work. I'm not going to explain to them why I'm asking them to make a save. And they have to find out. They have to play to find out. And holy cow, was this fun. It was tough. There were moments where I wanted I wanted to slip kind of back into, well, yeah, you can do that. Or yeah, I had to kind of catch myself. I'm out of practice. But at lunch, it must have affected the game enough, because at lunch, that's what we talked about. And at lunch, they were very surprised, and in a way, how formal I was, behind them, Mac, only telling them what they. And the other thing I did that I normally don't do is I was in complete control of all of the information. I was in complete control of the narrative. I was in complete control of the truth of the world. They were characters in it, and they could make decisions. They could take action. They could express their emotions. They could express themselves. But outside of that, I didn't ask them, well, what's the name of the horse? Or I didn't invite them to contribute to any truth other than their character itself in the world, which is traditional, right? I was a traditional DM. And it was really good, too, because it helped me narrate combat in such a way that they didn't get into the hit and miss thing, because I was narrating that you struck it, but it doesn't appear, So I was able to narrate the combat in such a way that it also kept things moving, and there was a cohesiveness to the entire session. As Brian said, what it did was it was me. I mean, they got me. They got my imaginative space of this for what that's worth. Some people may not like my imaginative space or my take on things. But as Brian said, we definitely got your flavor in this, as opposed to it being without atmosphere. There's certain, I guess the way I run my games very often, I leave a lot of detail and a lot of things out. And there sometimes you could say it lacks a little atmosphere that way. With this, Brian assured me definitely, and they all did too, but Brian's played with me in old school sessions, hundreds of sessions, and I've just never run it that formal. So it was great fun for me, and there were moments where I had to remind myself, right, they've got to eat, check the box. That's how out of practice I had gotten. We never had any moment where she had to make a thief check where I would have done that for her. Now, if she said, I'm picking a lock, I would have said, you need to roll that. If she would have said, I'm going to try to dismantle the trap, I would have said, you need to roll that. She would have rolled those things. But like the dwarf finding secret passages, I would have made those rolls passively. Unless he says, I'm looking for secret passages, then I would say, well, hey, if there's one here, go ahead and make a roll. But I'm trying to avoid that meta. I'm trying to also avoid them, which kind of happened the other night in our Joth game. I'm going to try the door. When I fill the door, then everybody gets in line. I'll try the door. I'll try the door. I'll try. It's like, it's crazy. It's like, that's, let's all put our shoulders into it, and we all just make a roll, and one of us is bound to open the door. Why are we then getting in line to try the door, right? And I think either the GM makes those rolls and says, yeah, it looks like you got the door open, or all the players just make a roll to open doors, and whoever succeeds opens the damn door, right? And that way we all make one roll, and somebody's bound to get it, or we're all going to fail, and that's it. No more trying to open the door, right? So those are the things I was trying to avoid in a way, right? They did light a torch, but they only had to go about 60 feet back into this cave, and it was narrow and windy. They had to come into a single file. That's why they needed the torch, because if it had been a broad cave and they got back to the back, and they have not showed the samples to Dodd. There was too much going on to even approach Dodd about the ore samples. Dodd did share with him when they first met that he was limited on what he had available, and he was limited on what he could make because he didn't have any raw materials. That was a kind of a hint to them that they would need to supply him with some raw materials. The general store, Zero, they did meet Zero, and Zero I gave him the traditional lost caravan. I dangled the quest of going out and looking for a lost shipment. They know it, but they didn't partake in it. Vincent gave them the, hey, I'll make you a deal on staying at the inn if you go investigate Herod's Ridge. In that sense, a lot of tropes, traditional, but that's what we want. We want these kind of tropes. We want to have these kind of fantasy games. They all earned in total about 400, I think it was 520 gold XP divided by 4, divided by 3 because one died. So they got to divide 520 by 3, and they all had 120 gold. They divided by 3. So they all have what, 40 gold each or something, 50 gold. What is that? 120 divided by 3, 40 gold each, because Charles's character died. And then we'll make his next character. They all had a good time. I had a great time. So that's it. So this was not a hex crawl. This was a map crawl. As they moved and as we rolled to find out what went down for the day, I blocked it in to let them know they've been there, we've done it, let's move. And then he moved on this direction, northeast. And when we rolled to find out what it was, they're going down in that 15-mile block, that 15 square mile, whatever, roughly a league, about 20 miles on foot. Right. And again, they wouldn't know everything in that 20-mile block. Right. I mean, that's a lot of real estate. But the main event that had happened to them on that day. And again, so they now know there's a group of about 12 miners out there trying to reopen an old mine. They found a cave that had some ore in it that's only about 50 feet deep, 60 feet deep. They discovered, they did get to Herod's Ridge. They discovered what was, haunting or killing and whatever on Herod's Ridge. It was this transformed man as this beast. They went on to Galstadt, got the witch came back. They performed a ritual that was able to save one of them. And unfortunately for Phil, he loses Charles. But fortunately for the Lord, his eldest son is cured from the blood and her magics. So it's very cool. So anyway, I enjoyed it, and they did too. So again, 6 hours, not bad. All right, everybody out there, have a great week. Bye-bye.